Thank you very much, Albert. Thank you for being here. We have till 1 o'clock, right? Okay. I'll try and get through the information as quick as possible because a lot of the ideas that I'm going to present today are fairly new ideas, and I would love to get your feedback on them. So they're ideas that we've been kicking around in our head for like the last few months. So any feedback you could give on this would be greatly appreciated. The first part of, maybe the first 10 or 15 minutes, I'll talk about some research that we've been doing about trying to apply common pool resource theory to understand Indonesia's deforestation, which has been one of the highest rates in the world for the past 30 or 40 years. And then the last part of it will be how I'm trying to apply common pool resource theory through our NGO to help protect some of the forests. A little bit of background. Has anybody here been to Borneo? It's one of the most biologically rich places on this planet. It's the world's oldest forests. Over 300,000 animal species. There's 17% of the global animal species is actually found there. Incredible plant and animal diversity. In one 100-hectare plot, they found over 1,500 different species of trees, which is more trees than all of North America. It's an incredibly biologically rich place. Cultural diversity, there's over 800 different ethnic groups represented within over 17,000 islands. So it's culturally extremely diverse, biologically diverse. However, Indonesia is facing incredible deforestation. In 1950, the island of Borneo was pretty much covered with vast, lush, forests. By 2012, there's about 48% of the forest left. Sumatra is very similar. 50% of the forests have been lost. And the next frontier is actually Papua. And they say what has happened on Sumatra and also on this island of Borneo could happen in Papua within the next 10 years, that it could go extremely fast. So deforestation is happening at an extremely fast rate. And it's pretty hard to imagine the scale of deforestation. You have to see it. To find good forest on the islands, it takes a lot of work to get there. To get to our project site, it takes 18 hours minimum just to find good forest. And I just wanted to show you a short clip from the movie Home, which talks a little bit about one of the reasons for this current deforestation, which is actually from palm oil. And it gives you a little bit of the sense
Barely 20 years ago, Borneo
of what's happening on the island.
in the world was covered by a vast primary forest. At the current rate of deforestation, it will have totally disappeared within 10 years.
So this is pretty much what you see when you go to the island of Borneo. Vast, vast tracts of palm oil plantations.
In Borneo, this bond has been broken in what was one of the Earth's greatest reservoirs of biodiversity.
So what you have is these lush rainforests being replaced by a single species, which is the oil palm. A fairly new phenomenon is coal mining. Coal mining has been going on the island since probably the late 1980s, early 1990s, but it's been the last 10 years that coal mining has increased dramatically. And there are many places on the island where we'd be hiking through dense tropical jungle, and within 2 months, this is what it looks like. The scale and the pace of development is happening so fast. And all the coal is going directly up to China for their development. So I'm working with a team of scholars, and we call ourselves the Social Ecological Systems Meta-Analysis Database, or SES-MAD. And what we are trying to look at is we're trying to see if we can use common pool resource theory to understand some of this deforestation. And there's quite a few theoretical approaches that have been used to try and look at the human-forest interactions. One of them is CPR theory, and in the past, CPR theory, common pool resource, has been more looking at small-scale systems. So it's a single village managing a single forest, a single village managing fisheries. It's never been applied to large-scale systems. What we're trying to do is trying to see if CPR theory also applies to large-scale systems. And we also want to see if we can apply CPR theory to understand the outcomes, what's been happening within Indonesia for the past 45 years. So we've been working on this. And a lot of what we've been working on is based on the SES framework, which Ostrom proposed first in PNAS in 2007 and then again in 2009. And we were in the process of building this database. And in terms of structuring our database and structuring each one of our cases, we built it around this SES framework, where you have the governance system, actors, resource units, and resource systems. We actually merged resource system and resource units into something we call resources. And then the interaction of those particular variables yields certain outcomes. So in Indonesia, when we were dividing up the case, we divided up into two different time periods. One is from 1965 to 1998. General Suharto came into power in 1965, and he ruled Indonesia till 1998. And we divided it up in the particular SES framework variables. So you've got the governance system, which is the New Order governance system. You've got the resource unit, which will be the forest of Indonesia. And the actors are Adat communities, which are the local indigenous communities, the extractive industries, district governments, and the New Order government. Now, under Suharto, what you had was a highly centralized government controlled by a limited number of actors, extracting resources at a very fast rate. The Adat communities were suppressed, so they lost their power. And the timber industries, mining companies, palm oil industries were controlled by the military elite. In 1997, you had the Asian economic crisis, and in 1998, Suharto fell. And this is what it looked like. You have more actors. So you had a more democratic government. You had the first free and fair elections. District governments gained a little bit more control, so they could hand out logging palm oil concessions. Local communities gained a lot more control. Local entrepreneurs emerged to connect the resource industries with the local communities. You had a new government, and you had this rise of civil society and social media, which I think is very interesting. And we wanted to explore the impact of social media and civil society, but we couldn't find any research that has been done on it yet. And so I think the actor group, when you're looking at civil society, social media, that's something which warrants a lot further research in terms of the impact that actor group had on slowing down deforestation. So when we were organizing our database within actor groups, governance system, and also the resource system, this is how the database is conceptualized. We used the 30 plus CPR variables, and of course we couldn't analyze the outcomes given the 30 plus CPR variables, so we picked out the variables which we felt were most important for this particular case. Those are highlighted in black. So, for example, variables like collective choice, proportionality, rights to organize, social monitoring, those are variables which are captured quite often in CPR theory. What we found, though, is that when we scaled up the use of CPR theory from like a small scale system to a large system, a lot of variables within CPR theory weren't mentioned. Like, for example, if you look into GS, the intention of the governance system is something which is not described in CPR literature, but was extremely important in this case. International politics and also international markets are two things which are not described within the literature, but are very important in this particular case. Now, we're looking at can we use CPR theory to explain the outcomes? And the outcomes in this case is deforestation rates. This is deforestation rate in Indonesia from 1950 until 2010. The dashed line represents scant data because it was hard to get data from 1950 until about 1985. But more or less the trend from 1950 until 1998 was very fast deforestation, with the rates after 1998 slowing down considerably. The deforestation within Indonesia is still one of the fastest in the world, but it has slowed. So something happened in 1998 that forced it to slow. We wanted to see if some of the CPR variables could actually explain that shift around 2000. So there's a lot I could talk about here, but some of the key findings that came out of this was that CPR theory applies only partially to governance of Indonesian forests. The key variables such as monitoring and sanctioning, tenure security, participation in rulemaking, rights to organize, emerged as important causes for the deforestation because they didn't exist under Suharto from 1965 until 2008. And changes in these variables probably help explain the slowdown in deforestation post-1998. But I think it's the key finding number 2 and number 3 in terms of saying that CPR theory doesn't quite work when we're scaling it up from a small-scale system to a large system. And that when you look at CPR theory, it largely assumes that you have local leaders and they're trying to solve collective action problems that hinder sustainability. However, in this case, you had a strong leader whose intention had nothing to do with sustainable outcomes. He wanted to extract resources, and he did it extremely well. So the concept of intentionality, I think, in this case is extremely important and is not captured within the CPR literature. The third thing from 1998 onwards is the role of international politics and also pressure. REDD is something which is extremely important on the island right now. Pressure from the UNFCCC, I don't know if that's the correct number of C's that should be in there. And Norway. Indonesia is the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So there's a lot of pressure on Indonesia to reduce CO2 emissions, and most of that comes from burning forests. Indonesia is also the world's largest social media user. And the social media, orangutan campaigns, palm oil campaigns have had a huge effect. So I think these are also a couple of variables that are not captured within CPR theory, but I think need to be explored a little bit further in terms of explaining why some of the deforestation rates still are high within Indonesia and why they have slowed a little bit as well. That was quick, and I'd be happy to answer questions about that. But I want to spend the rest of it is talk about how do we actually apply it. So we know that CPR theory can be useful for explaining some of the reasons, the underlying reasons for this deforestation. If we can expand it a little bit to include things like international markets, international politics, intentionality, it might be a little bit more useful. But can you use it to actually set up a conservation project? I've been working on the island of Indonesia for going on 5 years now. We run an NGO, and one of the greatest challenges that I find is that when you go into a place, what do you do? Like, how do you know, like, there's 1,000 things that you could do, but you can only do 10? What are those 10 things that you can actually choose to do? I found that common pool resource theory as a way of looking at these communities in terms of setting up conservation projects is extremely helpful, and I want to share with you how we're actually using it on the ground. It's that applied part which I'm extremely interested in terms of how do you take the research and apply it into tangible outcomes on the ground for local communities. So the project that I want to talk about is in East Kalimantan. It's the Wahea Forest. It's a biologically rich forest. It's 38,000 hectares. We've been doing research there for 5 years now. It is a biodiversity hotspot on the island. Large population of primates, clouded leopards, monkeys, you name it. The wonderful thing about Wahea Forest, which is unique from other forested areas on the island, is that if you look at the larger map, you've got Wahea Forest in the pink to the left-hand side. It's still surrounded by very good forest. A lot of other forests on the island are islands themselves. They're forested areas surrounded by palm oil plantations. Where Wahea Forest, if we can protect that, and if we could work with the logging companies, it's still a great enough area that we could save a large number of animal species, animal and plant species. The community that we work with are the Wahea Dayak, and in 2004, the Wahea Dayak found that their land was being eroded. They've lost most of their land because of palm oil. Coal mining companies are now coming in, and they wanted to stand up and protect what was left of their land, which is the 38,000 hectare forest. So we came in 2008, and at that time they had declared it protected, but they didn't know what to do. Like how do you protect an area like this in the face of palm oil companies come in and coal mining companies come in? How do you manage it? How do you keep local people involved? How do you keep kids involved who are more interested in cell phones and television than in orangutans and clouded leopards? So you had an extremely strong leader here, this guy in the middle, Pak Lejitak, whose intentions were to protect the forest. So that was something which was a good place to start. And a community that was also supportive of it. It's also a community that still relies on the forest for food, resources, building mats. Here are some women from the forest going out to collect plants to make mats from. Culturally, they're still reliant on the forest in terms of a lot of the spirits from the forest are found in their dances, and they want to appease the spirits by doing these dances every year. And a lot of the animals are represented within their dances. So there still is that cultural connection to the forest. You have strong leadership, strong cultural connection first, and a community that really wants to protect this area. The challenge that they're facing, though, is that Wahea Forest is the pink on the left-hand side. The community is found at the very, very bottom of this map. They're about 70 kilometers from their forest. So 15 years ago, it was continuous forest from their community up to Wahea. Within the last 10 or 15 years, palm oil and coal mining companies have separated them from their forest. So they're finding that this separation is causing problems because the kids are no longer connected to the forest. They're not able to go out and hunt within the forest. People are losing interest in actually protecting it. So that's one of the challenges which we are facing. So how do we use common pool resource theory to actually inform a conservation project? And I know of a lot of NGOs on the ground that when they go into a community, they don't necessarily know what to do. And that's no criticism. It's just hard to know where do you actually start. And with limited funds, how do you actually know what to do? I think common pool resource theory could actually help. So for example, I want to tell you how we're using some of the CPR variables and integrating them into some of the programs which we are doing, or informing the programs that we should actually focus on. For example, economic dependence. CPR literature says that if a community is economically depends on a forest, there is more incentive to actually protect it. So we are starting a project where they're going out and gathering seedlings from the forest, taking them back into the village, growing the seedlings as trees, and making money from it. Selling the seedlings to coal mining companies and other companies who have to reforest areas. This is it's a very easy way of not hurting the forest, but also of increasing the economic dependence on the forest itself. Cultural dependence, I said before that they all are still culturally tied to the forest, but with that physical connection or disconnect from the forest, we're finding that the young kids aren't tied culturally to the forest like they should be. So one of our pushes is to start a program to bring kids into the forest and to sing songs, to learn about the forest, to learn about traditional songs and dances. And we're having some success with that in terms of getting kids interested in actually wanting to protect it. Nesting and multi-level governance, working at the local level and all the way up to the governor, provincial level. Focusing on the local rangers who are working every single day in the forest to manage it. All the way up to connecting the local community with the provincial governance. This is the governor of East Kalimantan, and this is a meeting that we had just a few months ago where we were trying to convince the governor to declare Wahea Forest a protected area. The rights to organize and collective choice, two variables which are extremely important and that may yield sustainable outcomes when you're talking about forest management. Under Suharto, the rights to organize and collective choice was gone. For 30 years, the indigenous communities lost their rights to organize. They had no say in governing their forests. So a lot of the local communities lost the ability or knowledge in terms of how do we actually manage these areas now. So one of the things that we're working on with them, which they asked us to do, is how do we organize? How do we bring indigenous communities together? How do we manage this forest? This is a building of a conservation center which was prompted by the local community, and it will be a place where indigenous communities and people from all over the area will be able to come and learn different types of forest management from the Waheadak, who are going through this process right now. Here's a meeting which they're having about how do we get young kids into the forest, and how do we organize the forest rangers. Some of the first times that they've been able to organize like this since the early 1960s. Leadership, extremely important. I mentioned before that the local community has an extremely strong leader in the head of the community, the chief of the village. But I believe it's not enough to focus on the leaders that are already present. We're also focusing on building the young leaders. University scholarships, education, 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 getting those kids into university, developing their leadership skills, and also seeing if we can get them involved in local level politics and also regional level politics. Some other CPR variables, monitoring and sanctioning, probably one of the most significant variables that equates to forest outcomes, positive forest outcomes. We now have 35 rangers on the ground that are patrolling the forest, and that every day work to keep the coal miners out, keep the illegal loggers out, and keep the hunters out. Land security. They have had an area of land, they've known what area of their land is, but they've never mapped it. So when they're going up against palm oil companies and they're going up against coal mining companies, it's pretty hard for them to say anything about where my land ends and where other land begins. So we've started a process with the local community about mapping their area, about mapping where their ladangs are, which are their farming areas, mapping where their forest areas, mapping their culturally important sites, which hopefully they can use when they're going up against some of these companies in the future. Boundary clarity. We've got the forest, and a lot of the forest falls within a 2-year moratorium on logging, which the president of Indonesia declared last year, but nothing has been mapped by the local community. So getting out there with the local community and mapping these areas. Where are the boundaries between the forest concessions? If we can map exactly where this moratorium forest falls within the Wahea forest, if somebody comes into the forest to log it, we can take them to court, because there is now legal standing to do so. So these are rated, they were actually out in the forest just a couple weeks ago doing this. And trust among actor groups, another important variable found within CPR literature. The previous map that I showed you that Wahea forest was surrounded by logging concessions, so we have to work with our neighbors. So this is we started a joint research project with the logging communities to monitor animal activity, logging on animal activity. And we found that research is a very easy entry point to working with various actors. There's no judgment. You're going out there, we're setting camera traps, we're going on the roads, and it's a way of building trust between the Waheadak, who are working to protect the forest, and the logging companies who are logging the forests. So I briefly mentioned this idea of the role of civil society and the role of social media. I think from an NGO standpoint that needs to be explored further as well. I think investing in helping the Waheadak to become more involved in terms of social media, getting access to social media, getting them involved on Facebook, Twitter, other things, getting them to promote their own project is where we are heading. And this is an area that I think warrants a lot further research. But I think particularly in a case like Indonesia, has had a huge impact. So very briefly, switching into the ecological realm, some of the ecological research which we have going on. We've got a research program on these guys right here. We know there's orangutans in the forest, but funny enough, people know very little about them. Their life history, where they go for extended periods of time. We just found out last year that from our research that they tend to walk on the ground much more than anyone had ever thought. And we have a publication coming out in a couple months which is going to describe this, and that could have large implications for areas that we work to protect. The Miller's grizzled langur is a monkey that we discovered in Wahea Forest just last year. They thought it was extinct. We found it in Wahea Forest last year, And the funny thing about it is it just shows you how little is known about these forests. I mean, here's a monkey they thought was gone, and it's still living in this forest. Bornean Bay cat. We don't have a research project going on them, but I just think it's a cool cat. Yeah, cool cat. It's up until 2003, they thought this cat was extinct. They think there's probably only 2,500 mating pairs left on the island. Extremely rare. We've got a behavioral work going on this monkey right here, the maroon langur. We're starting a population, to estimate population densities of the gibbon. We'll be starting that next summer. Argus pheasant, nothing going on with them. I just think it's a very cool picture of a male Argus pheasant displaying his feathers to a female, and the female looking extremely disinterested in it. Also another cool picture. It's we don't have any research going on these guys, but they're fun to look at night, and this is my favorite animal, and it's inspired the logo. The clouded leopard. It's the largest cat on the island, and we're doing work. Some of my work right now is looking at estimating densities within the forest, and also looking at the impact of logging on this cat, because it's one of the 6 biggest cats in the world, but it's a cat that people know very little about. But the thing which I think is important about it is it has a strong cultural connection to the Dayak. They find it to be a very culturally important species, so therefore we can gain some traction through them in terms of doing research on this as opposed to the orangutan. So just briefly to sum up, I guess we did find CPR theory to be useful in to some extent in terms of scaling it up to describe patterns of deforestation. However, I think there were some variables that we found that weren't described within the CPR literature that we found to be important in this case. And I also believe that CPR literature can be used on the ground by NGOs that are looking to have an impact. I think there are some applied aspects of it that could be investigated further. So thank you very much for your time. That was extremely quick, a lot of information. I guess in the last 9 minutes, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything you guys got. So thank you very much.